The morning of October 16, 1941, stands as one of the most harrowing moments in the history of Moscow, a date when the Soviet capital teetered on the edge of obliteration, and the crown jewel of Stalin's industrialization program faced total destruction. On that gray autumn morning, the Moscow Metro, the magnificent underground palace that had opened just 6 years earlier, as a symbol of socialist achievement and Soviet engineering prowess, remained closed to passengers for the first and only time in what would become its 88-year history. But this was no ordinary closure for maintenance or repairs. Deep beneath the streets of Moscow, in the marble-lined halls and along the ornate platforms that had once hosted thousands of workers and citizens each day, demolition crews were frantically placing explosives and preparing to flood the tunnels with water, transforming the pride of the Soviet Union into a subterranean tomb that would deny the advancing Wehrmacht any use of the system. The order had come from the very top, from men who had built the metro and who now prepared to destroy it. And the fact that this destruction was halted literally at the last minute speaks to the chaos, desperation, and razor-thin margins that defined those terrible October days when Nazi forces stood at the gates of Moscow and the fate of the Soviet Union hung in the balance. To understand why Stalin and his inner circle would contemplate such a drastic act, one must first grasp the catastrophic military situation that had developed in the opening weeks of Operation Typhoon, the German code name for the assault on Moscow that began on September 30th, 1941. After the initial shock of Operation Barbarossa in June had worn off, and Soviet forces had managed to stabilize certain sectors of the front through the summer months, the Wehrmacht launched what it intended to be the decisive blow of the entire Eastern campaign. Army Group Center, commanded by Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, concentrated over 1 million men, 1,400 tanks, and nearly 20,000 artillery pieces for a massive pincer movement designed to encircle and destroy the Soviet forces defending the approaches to Moscow. The German plan worked with devastating efficiency in the opening phase. Near the ancient city of Vyazma, approximately 240 kilometers west of Moscow, Soviet defensive positions collapsed under the weight of coordinated panzer thrusts and Luftwaffe bombing. By October 7, 1941, German armored spearheads had closed the trap, encircling 4 Soviet armies comprising over 600,000 men. The Battle of Vyazma stands as one of the greatest encirclement disasters in military history, rivaling even the catastrophe at Kiev just weeks earlier. Soviet commanders struggled to maintain cohesion as German forces systematically reduced the pocket. And while significant numbers of Red Army soldiers would eventually fight their way out of the encirclement over the following weeks, the immediate result was the effective disintegration of the primary defensive line protecting Moscow. By October 13th, German reconnaissance units had reached points less than 100 kilometers from the Soviet capital. Panic began to spread through Moscow as civilians and officials alike realized that the front had collapsed far more completely than official communiques admitted. The NKVD reported instances of looting, attempts by officials to flee the city without authorization, and a general breakdown of the discipline that the Soviet system depended upon. Documents were burned in government offices, creating clouds of smoke that hung over the city and added to the apocalyptic atmosphere. The Lenin Mausoleum was emptied, and its contents evacuated eastward. The Bolshoi Theater prepared to relocate. Major industrial facilities that had not already been moved beyond the Urals made hasty preparations for demolition. It was against this backdrop of military catastrophe and civilian panic that the State Defense Committee, the small war cabinet headed by Stalin that exercised supreme authority over the Soviet war effort, convened on October 15, 1941, to make decisions that would determine whether Moscow would be defended or abandoned. The State Defense Committee, known by its Russian acronym GKO, had been established on June 30, 1941, just 8 days after the German invasion, concentrating all political and military power in the hands of Stalin and a small group of his most trusted subordinates. On that October day, the committee included Stalin himself as chairman, Vyacheslav Molotov as deputy chairman, Klement Voroshilov, Georgy Malenkov, and Lavrenti Beria. The decisions made in that meeting would shape not only the immediate fate of Moscow, but the entire trajectory of the war on the Eastern Front. The decree issued by the State Defense Committee on October 15th formalized what had already begun informally in preceding days: the evacuation of Moscow. The document outlined which government agencies would relocate to Kuibyshev, a city on the Volga River, over 800 kilometers to the east, that would serve as the alternative capital if Moscow fell. The diplomatic corps, most government ministries, and key party officials were ordered to evacuate immediately. But the decree went further, addressing the fate of those assets that could not be moved. Enterprises, warehouses, and institutions that could not be evacuated were to be destroyed to prevent them from falling into German hands. This scorched earth policy was not new. It had been applied across vast stretches of Soviet territory as the Red Army retreated during the summer and autumn of 1941, leaving behind burned crops, demolished factories, and destroyed infrastructure. But applying this policy to Moscow itself, to the capital of the Soviet state, and the ideological heart of the communist system, represented a psychological and political threshold that few had imagined would be crossed. Among the assets marked for destruction was the Moscow Metro, and responsibility for executing this task fell to Lazar Kaganovich, the People's Commissar of Communication Routes. Kaganovich was no minor functionary, but one of Stalin's oldest and most loyal associates, a man who had risen through the party ranks to become one of the most powerful figures in the Soviet hierarchy. Born in 1893 to a Jewish family in Ukraine, Kaganovich had joined the Bolshevik Party in 1911 and had proven himself during the Civil War as a ruthless and effective organizer. By the 1930s, he had become one of Stalin's chief lieutenants, serving at various times as head of the Moscow Party Organization, People's Commissar of Transport, and a full member of the Politburo. He was known for his administrative efficiency, his willingness to use extreme measures to achieve results, and his unquestioning loyalty to Stalin. Significantly, Kaganovich had overseen the construction of the Moscow Metro in his capacity as Moscow Party chief in the mid-1930s, making him intimately familiar with every tunnel, station, and technical system in the network. The Moscow Metro was far more than a transportation system. It was a propaganda masterpiece, a physical manifestation of the Soviet Union's claim to be building a new and superior civilization. Construction had begun in 1931 as part of Stalin's first five-year plan, employing tens of thousands of workers, including Komsomol volunteers, engineers, and forced laborers. The first line opened on May 15, 1935, running 11 kilometers and serving 13 stations, each designed as an underground palace featuring marble columns, elaborate chandeliers, mosaics, sculptures, and artwork celebrating Soviet achievements and socialist realism. Stalin himself had taken a personal interest in the project, reviewing designs and insisting that the metro stations should serve as palaces for the people, demonstrating that socialism could create beauty and grandeur for the working class, rather than reserving such luxuries for the elite. By 1941, the system had expanded to 3 lines, totaling more than 40 kilometers with 43 stations, carrying hundreds of thousands of passengers daily, and serving as a point of genuine pride for Muscovites and a showcase that foreign visitors were regularly taken to see. The order Kaganovich issued on the night of October 15th was brutally direct. The metro was to be closed, and within 3 hours, proposals for its destruction were to be prepared, with facilities to be destroyed by any means necessary. The speed demanded reflects the urgency of the situation and the genuine belief among Soviet leadership that German forces might enter Moscow within days or even hours. The methods of destruction were to be comprehensive. Escalators. The massive moving staircases that transported passengers from street level to the deep platforms below were to be dismantled to prevent their use by German forces. Technical equipment, including electrical systems, signaling apparatus, and communications infrastructure, was to be removed or destroyed. But most dramatically, the tunnels themselves were to be rendered unusable through a combination of explosives and flooding. Engineers and demolition teams worked through the night of October 15th and into the early morning hours of October 16th, placing charges at strategic points throughout the system. Simultaneously, preparations were made to breach the tunnels at points where the metro ran beneath the Moscow River, allowing the river water to flood into the underground passages and create an impassable barrier. The technical challenges of flooding the Moscow metro were considerable but not insurmountable. The system had been constructed using the cut-and-cover method for shallow sections and deep boring for sections that ran far beneath the surface, with some stations located more than 30 meters underground. The deepest sections were naturally protected from flooding, but the portions of the network that ran close to or beneath the Moscow River could be deliberately breached to allow water infiltration. Once water entered the tunnels, the interconnected nature of the system would allow flooding to spread throughout much of the network, particularly the lower-lying sections. The marble and tile that adorned the stations would be destroyed or damaged beyond repair. The electrical systems would be ruined, and the tunnels themselves would become unusable without massive pumping and reconstruction efforts that would take months or years. For an advancing army seeking to use the metro for troop movement, shelter, or storage, the flooded tunnels would present an impassable obstacle. As dawn broke on October 16th, the demolition work continued, but the situation above ground had reached a critical point. October 16th, 1941, would be remembered as one of the darkest days in Moscow's history, a day when the city seemed to hover on the brink of collapse. With word spreading that the government was evacuating and that preparations were being made to destroy key facilities, panic seized large portions of the population. Crowds gathered at railway stations, hoping to board evacuation trains. Looting broke out in some districts as ordinary citizens, convinced that the Germans would soon arrive, took what they could. Party officials burned documents and, in some cases, abandoned their posts. The NKVD struggled to maintain order, and there were reports of security forces shooting looters and deserters. The smoke from burning documents and demolished facilities hung over the city, and the absence of the metro, which normally opened early to transport workers to their jobs, added to the sense that the normal functioning of the city had ceased. But even as demolition crews worked in the metro tunnels and chaos spread through the streets above, a critical reassessment was taking place at the highest levels of Soviet leadership. Stalin, who had remained in Moscow despite the evacuation of much of the government, was receiving updated intelligence on German movements and the state of Soviet defensive preparations. General Georgy Zhukov, who had been appointed commander of the Western Front on October 10th with the specific mandate to save Moscow, was rushing reinforcements to the front lines and establishing new defensive positions. Critically, Zhukov reported that while the situation remained desperate, the German advance was beginning to slow due to a combination of factors. Soviet resistance was stiffening as fresh divisions arrived from the interior and Far East. German supply lines were stretched thin after the rapid advance, and the autumn rains had begun turning roads into impassable mud, hampering German mobility. The Rasputitsa, the season of mud that comes twice a year in Russia during the spring thaw and autumn rains, was beginning to work in favor of the defenders. Based on this reassessment, the State Defense Committee made a fateful decision. Moscow would be held. The evacuation would be limited rather than total, and the destruction of key facilities would be halted. The order to destroy the Moscow metro was rescinded, and Kaganovich received urgent instructions to restore the system to operation as quickly as possible. This reversal came literally at the last minute, with demolition crews already in position and some preparatory destruction already completed. Workers who had spent the night dismantling equipment and placing explosives now had to reverse course and frantically restore what they had damaged. Escalators that had been partially disassembled had to be reassembled. Electrical systems that had been disconnected had to be reconnected. Explosives had to be carefully removed from positions where they had been placed. The fact that the metro was able to resume operation within hours speaks to both the incomplete nature of the demolition work and the desperate energy with which restoration was undertaken. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon on October 16th, one of the metro lines had been re-energized, and by 7 o'clock that evening, full train service had been restored throughout the system. The metro's reopening sent a powerful psychological signal to the population of Moscow. The government had not abandoned the city. Normal life would continue, and Moscow would be defended. For citizens who had spent the day in fear and uncertainty, the sight of metro trains running again provided tangible evidence that the crisis, while severe, had not resulted in total collapse. The decision to keep the metro operating would prove to be correct. The Battle of Moscow, which raged from October 1941 through January 1942, became one of the decisive engagements of World War II. Despite coming within sight of the Kremlin spires, German forces were unable to break through the Soviet defenses. The combination of fierce resistance, harsh winter weather, and the arrival of fresh Soviet divisions from the east forced the Wehrmacht into its first major retreat of the war. The failure to capture Moscow marked the end of the German blitzkrieg strategy and the beginning of a long, grinding war of attrition that the Third Reich was ultimately unable to win. The Moscow metro itself played a significant role during the siege, though not in the way that German planners might have hoped to use it. During the frequent German air raids on Moscow, the metro stations served as bomb shelters for civilians, with thousands of Muscovites sleeping on the platforms during the worst periods of bombing. The deep stations, some more than 30 meters below ground, provided excellent protection from even heavy bombs. Photographs from the period show families with bedding and personal belongings camped on the platforms, with trains running between them on reduced schedules. Children were born in the metro during air raids, and some stations were equipped with medical facilities and food distribution points. In this sense, the metro became a literal underground city, sustaining the population through the darkest days of the siege. Had the tunnels been flooded and destroyed in October 1941, thousands of civilians would have lost this refuge. And the psychological impact on Moscow's population would have been devastating. The near destruction of the Moscow metro in October 1941 reveals several critical aspects of the Soviet war effort and Stalin's leadership during the Great Patriotic War, as the conflict is known in Russia. First, it demonstrates the genuine desperation that gripped Soviet leadership in the autumn of 1941, when the military situation appeared catastrophic and the survival of the Soviet state itself seemed in doubt. The willingness to destroy the metro, a prestige project that had consumed enormous resources and stood as a symbol of Soviet achievement, shows that no asset was considered too valuable to sacrifice if it might aid the enemy. Second, it illustrates the highly centralized nature of Soviet decision-making, with critical choices about the fate of Moscow being made by a handful of men in the State Defense Committee, and with implementation entrusted to loyal party veterans like Kaganovich, who could be relied upon to execute even the most drastic orders without question. Third, it highlights the razor-thin margins on which history sometimes turns. Had the decision to halt the destruction been made a few hours later, or had the demolition crews worked more quickly, the metro might have been damaged beyond rapid repair, depriving Moscow of a critical transportation and shelter asset during the siege and dealing a severe blow to civilian morale at a crucial moment. The fact that Lazar Kaganovich, the man who had overseen the metro's construction and who took such pride in the achievement, was the same man ordered to destroy it carries a certain tragic irony. Kaganovich survived the war and remained in Stalin's inner circle until the dictator's death in 1953, though his influence waned in subsequent years. He was removed from the Politburo in 1957 during the power struggle following Stalin's death and lived in obscurity until his death in 1991 at the age of 97, one of the last surviving members of Stalin's original leadership group. In his later years, he rarely spoke publicly about the events of October 1941, but the metro he had built and nearly destroyed continued to operate and expand, growing into one of the world's most extensive and heavily used subway systems. The October 1941 crisis also illuminates the broader Soviet strategy of scorched earth and the willingness to sacrifice territory, infrastructure, and even population centers to deny resources to the invader. This strategy had deep roots in Russian military history, dating back to the campaigns against Napoleon in 1812, when Russian forces retreated deep into the interior, burning crops and supplies, forcing the French to advance through a devastated landscape. Stalin explicitly invoked this historical precedent in his speeches, and the policy was applied systematically across the occupied territories. Factories were dismantled and shipped east, crops were burned, bridges were destroyed, and in some cases, entire cities were reduced to rubble rather than left intact for German use. The human cost of this strategy was immense, as millions of Soviet citizens found themselves caught between the retreating Red Army and the advancing Wehrmacht, with their homes and livelihoods destroyed by one side or the other. But from a purely military standpoint, the strategy succeeded in denying the Germans the resources they needed to sustain their offensive and contributed to the eventual Soviet victory. The decision to preserve Moscow and defend it rather than abandon it to destruction was one of the most consequential of the entire war. Had Stalin chosen differently, had he ordered the complete evacuation and demolition of the capital and retreated to continue the war from beyond the Urals, the psychological and political impact would have been incalculable. The loss of Moscow would have dealt a severe blow to Soviet morale, potentially weakened the legitimacy of Stalin's government, and might have encouraged wavering allies and neutral nations to reconsider their positions. Instead, the successful defense of Moscow provided the first major defeat inflicted on the Wehrmacht, demonstrated that the German military machine could be stopped, and gave hope to occupied peoples across Europe that Nazi Germany was not invincible. The battle also bought time for the Soviet war economy to relocate and reorganize beyond the Urals, where thousands of factories evacuated from Western Russia began producing the tanks, aircraft, and weapons that would eventually equip the Red Army for its drive to Berlin. Looking back across the decades, the near destruction of the Moscow metro stands as a footnote to the larger Battle of Moscow. But it encapsulates the desperation, the high stakes, and the narrow escapes that characterized those critical months. The metro that was saved on October 16, 1941, continued to serve Moscow through the remainder of the war, through the Soviet period, through the collapse of communism, and into the present day. It remains one of the world's most beautiful and efficient subway systems, with its original Stalinist stations still in use and still adorned with the marble, mosaics, and chandeliers that were nearly lost in 1941. Millions of Muscovites and visitors pass through these stations each year, most unaware of how close the system came to destruction, and of the frantic hours when demolition crews prepared to flood the tunnels and deny the Wehrmacht access to Stalin's underground palaces. The survival of the metro serves as a tangible reminder that history often turns on split-second decisions, that the monuments and institutions we take for granted were preserved through choices made under unimaginable pressure, and that the outcome of the Second World War, which reshaped the entire 20th century, was determined not by inevitability, but by thousands of individual decisions made by leaders, soldiers, and workers who faced impossible choices and somehow found a way forward through the darkness.